Welcome, scholars, to Lesson 1-4.6, The End of Feudalism, kinda. It's been a long journey. We've been talking about the feudal system and its development going all the way back to Europe in the post-Charlemagne days. Feudalism has been a part of our story throughout our discussion of manorialism and through the Crusades. We've referred back to this feudal structure. We even talked about it a little bit at the end of the Black Death, but we are now going to be kind of coming to a close, on our discussion of feudalism. So, before we talk about the end of feudalism, I know we know this inside and out by now, but I do want to walk through it one last time so we can talk about, what's ending. It's kind of like a funeral. We go back and talk about its life before we acknowledge its death. Feudalism was the dominant economic and social system in the Middle Ages. It really helped to establish the social hierarchy with the king at the top and our peasant serfs down at the bottom. And the economics of this was that food and feudal service and resources would work its way up to the king, and in exchange, the king would provide land to his nobles. They would provide land and protection on down the system. That was that feudal pyramid of power. The basics being protection in return for resources, and everybody owing some sort of feudal obligation to another. Now, the manor system was kind of feudalism writ small. It was this feudal system broken down to its most essential, in many ways, unit, the manor. This is where all the product of the feudal system came from. Serfs would work the land in return for the protection of that lord. So they'd be working most of their time working in the lord's fields. But some serfs, the villeins, were able to rent additional land and would work on this land for profit, and therefore were able to acquire some small amount of wealth for most of the feudal system. It wasn't until after the Black Death that they were able to bring down those rents, increase the land, and more of those villains would become freedmen by purchasing their freedom. Now, the medieval market fairs played a role in bringing down the feudal system. This is because it steps outside of that feudal system, the wealthy landowners and the serfs. Once we start to create a class of people, a large class of people eventually, that exist outside of that system, it breaks down that structure. And the market fairs played a big role in this by developing the middle class. If you recall, the market fairs themselves evolved out of the pilgrimage trade, which eventually led to increased east-west connections, more and more goods moving from European manors out to the east, and Eastern goods like spices and silks and pearls and whatnot moving into the Western markets. People in these market fairs were able to accumulate wealth and over time accumulated a lot of power. And this would be something that was outside of feudal structure, and therefore something that could help bring it down, the rise of a middle class. This predominantly happened, especially early on, in the towns themselves. These middle class merchants are growing extremely wealthy off of this trade of European wool and wine for Eastern spices in particular. That this merchant class starts to develop, and we start to see very wealthy, non-noble members of society. We also see skilled tradesmen, because the merchants would need to have regular relationships with people who could make barrels, who could transport goods, provide protection, and all of that could be purchased for them outside of a feudal obligation. So if you were, say, a barrel maker, a cooper, that worked for a very wealthy merchant, you could yourself become fairly wealthy in providing him your service. So initially, we're talking about a small population that exists outside of the feudal system, a small population of merchants and skilled tradesmen, but that does grow over time. The merchant class in particular is going to become very important because although initially they were small, And initially, their wealth was also small. It grows over the centuries. And by the 1300s, we start to see some merchants that are wealthier than minor nobles. We see merchants, cloth merchants in particular, that are wealthier than many of the barons within France and within England. These people are accumulating tremendous amounts of wealth, and it's not based upon the land. It's based upon their ability to transport goods. We see this really evolve in the Italian city-states, where merchants not only are becoming very wealthy, but they're becoming politically powerful. And in Venice and in Genoa, we have elections to the Doge, their leader, being run by citizens defined as, wealthy individuals with a certain property requirement. So definitely not the democracy of today, but we have merchants running the government in the sense that they are electing their leaders. So this wealthy middle class, which is totally outside of the feudal system, is really accumulating very true and actual power. This is happening alongside the decline in serfdom. When the Black Death comes around, we have this huge economic shift. Serfs become able to acquire more wealth and therefore purchase their own freedom. They start to charge more, and therefore the incentive for large property owners to have a lot of serfs on their land somewhat decreases. And the lords are really affected by this. They have to grant a larger share of their wealth to the serfs and freedmen increasingly that are operating on their manors. That means they themselves are keeping a smaller share, and therefore, as vassals to a greater lord, they're able to provide fewer and fewer resources up that feudal chain. So the kings at the top, the King of France, the King of England, the Holy Roman Emperor, they are getting less and less of their resources through these feudal obligations. Now, this does not mean that the kings themselves are going to receive fewer and fewer resources. These are powerful and generally intelligent individuals who are going to be able to find a new system for maintaining their power. They do so largely by forming new alliances. As the feudal system declines, kings recognize that the new rising power in their kingdoms and empires are the merchants. And it's in their best interest to be on the right side of the merchants. These people are motivated, they're wealthy, they're the kind of people that make great friends and make horrible enemies. So they work together hand in hand. The merchants do get taxed, but in exchange for that tax, the monarchs are going to help the merchants to increase their wealth and influence. They do so by guaranteeing protection. They do so by negotiating peace and war, sometimes with the influence of those merchants. Merchants want to make sure that they can trade with a neighbor without that neighbor taxing them. Well, a monarch might go to war to keep his merchants happy by making sure that they didn't have to pay taxes when trading with their neighbors. This can and did happen with some regularity throughout the later Middle Ages. Monarchs really being the military branch of an economic movement. So the kings and the merchants really do start to form tight alliances, so much so that we see numerous instances where kings are going to be financed in wars against their own vassals. If a vassal steps up against him, the king says, hey, I need an ally, I need money. He goes to the merchants themselves and says, hey, give me a lot of money and I'll make sure to continue to work in your best interests. And the kings actually get more powerful as the feudal system declines because their merchant alliances are so much more to their advantage. And that really does bring an end to the feudal system once these kings and merchants realize that not only can they work together, but they are better off working together than the kings working with their old vassal systems. So, like I said in a previous lesson, this is a slow process. This takes quite a long time to develop. Some places it happens faster and they really do benefit economically from their speed, getting out ahead of this thing. But it is essential to bringing down the end of feudalism. And with the end of feudalism, we soon find ourselves out of the Middle Ages and heading toward the Renaissance. But that is a topic for the third trimester. So we'll get back to this story later, but we're going to be taking a nice long break from Europe and taking a look at the Middle Ages in other areas of the world. So see you later, Europe. We loved you. We'll see you again, but it's time to look at some other things.